Hi, I'm Chris Wilson. Today I'm interviewing Phil Schenk, Peter Hu, and Erich Schaefer from Moonbeast Productions. These three gentlemen were instrumental in creating Diablo II and its expansion pack Lord of Destruction, and are now working on a new action RPG called Darkhaven. It's great to chat with you guys. Could you introduce yourselves, explain what your roles were on Diablo II and LOD, and what other games you've worked on, and what your role is on Darkhaven?
Sure, I'll give it a start. Erich Schaefer, you guys probably know me from Diablo primarily. I started Condor, which became Blizzard North, with my brother and David Grevick. We made Diablo 2, and after that, I left with these guys and a bunch of others to start Flagship Studios. We made Hellgate London. I take full responsibility for crashing that spectacularly. After that, though, I think I kind of recovered. Peter and I and a couple others started Runic Games. We made the Torchlight series, or Torchlight 1 and 2. I always seemed to leave after number 2, I guess. After that, I made a couple of space games, Rebel Galaxy and Rebel Galaxy Outlaw. And now I find myself here with these guys making Darkhaven.
Phil Schenk, CEO of Moonbeast. Erich sort of gave the introduction to what the three of us have done together. I met both of these guys at Blizzard North on Diablo 2. Specifically came there to work on Diablo 2. Diablo 1 was life-changing experience. And I really, really wanted to get the chance to work on Diablo 2. And then I actually left Blizzard for a while and went to work at a company called Wild Tangent doing 3D web games before 3D was a thing on the internet. And then came back for about a year before we left and did Flagship Studios. And then after Flagship Studios, I did a couple of my own companies. I had a company called Gravity Bear, and we were doing web games again. Did a small 3D web game called Battle Punks. We sold that company. I sold that company to Kabam, and then did some mobile games for a while. Got to do the whole large startup experience and see Kabam's trajectory. Worked on a ARPG there for mobile called Spirit Lords that unfortunately didn't really do very well. It was critically well received and fans liked it, but it wasn't making enough money. It was a free-to-play game. So we shut that down. And then I did another company with some folks from Kabam doing VR work. So I feel like I've done a lot of small startups and a couple of big things, mostly with these two. And then Peter and I joined up to start Moonbeast a while ago, a number of years ago, to make ARPGs again. So on Darkhaven, I stand in as art director, although I don't really do too much art anymore. At Blizzard North, I was lead artist on the character side, did a lot of the cinematics work, was really very hands-on, built, animated, textured the Amazon and the Necromancer, did a lot of the monsters for Diablo 2 and Dariel, ton of the monsters, especially in Act 1 and Act 2, and then moved on to do the expansion pack. But I haven't done art in years and years and years, but I can talk art. So I stand in as art director and then do a lot of the business development and fundraising and high-level design stuff.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having us on your show. Peter Hu. I'm an engineer that dabbles in design. I ended up doing a lot of different things on Diablo 2. Worked on every single system, I think, except for audio. One of my major roles was probably optimization, a little bit of client-side optimization, a lot of server-side optimization. Getting D2 to run 1K players on a box with like 100 mobs per player and nearly as many missiles was a pretty challenging task on Y2K hardware. But I think I did that really well. Blizzard was able to keep that game going for 25 decades. Without feeling a need to take it down due to costs. So, yeah, that was really fun. After Blizzard, I didn't quite join Flagship when it was first founded, though I was considered a founder. I stayed on to finish the last patch I was working on, but then left to do Hellgate London, where I was the technical director. After that, I formed Runic Games with Max and Eric and Travis, do Torchlight 1 and 2 as a principal engineer on Marvel Heroes Online and design lead for that as well. That was with Dave Brevik, and eventually that shut down. I started a little company to make an indie CCG, which I mentioned at the very beginning. That's called Mythgard, with Brian Bassick, who was one of the great engineers I met while working at Gazillion. And so we did that, and after that, I hooked up with Phil to make Darkhaven.
Nice. Great to see you guys. Erich, what is your role at Moonbeast?
My role is always sort of lead design. I like to think of myself as lead QA too, because I constantly test and report probably the most bugs on every game I've ever worked on. But so I've always been designer, and I'm lead design here too. Although Peter short sells himself, Phil too. These guys are really good designers. And that's what I did on Diablo, Diablo II, Torchlight, Hellgate, all these things. I used to do art, like in Diablo 1, I did all the environment art, I did all the UI stuff. That's just because we were a really tiny team, and I was, I guess, the most capable of a bunch of us who had no idea what we were doing at that kind of stuff. Diablo 2, though, we got Phil, we got a bunch of really good artists on that, and so I turned into pure design after that.
Nice. Is it hard to fill the shoes of Diablo 2? Are you worried that people have like impossibly high expectations for Darkhaven because of your history of working on such impressive games in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of been my whole career in a way. You know, always chasing Diablo 2. Gave up for a while, you know, with the space games. I said, I'm just going to make small games that reach a small audience. Although here with Darkhaven, I figured this is a great shot again for a big success. But it's impossible really to chase Diablo because, again, 25 years. I think Peter said 25 decades, which I think maybe it might actually last that long. To have a game that lasts, that you can still play and still people make content and stream for 25 years, that's unlikely going to happen again in my career. So yeah, sort of always under the shadow, but at the same time, it's a cool accomplishment and people all know it. So I'm happy about it.
Fair. Well, speaking about new content, I mean, as you guys know, Blizzard surprised us with the release of that big update to Diablo 2 like a couple of weeks ago with the new character class and everything. Like adding a new character class a quarter of a century since you guys added the last ones. How does it feel for you guys that the game that you worked on so long ago is experiencing a resurgence these days?
I mean, it makes me really proud that it's still happening. I mean, it also makes me wish I still had control over the property and I was benefiting from these things. But I think it's really cool. I have not played myself. I've been too busy right now, but I've been watching some streams and people are having a good time. And I just love the idea that this game is still being played so widely.
Fair enough. And Peter, you were working on Diablo 2 updates basically single-handedly for a while. So how do you feel about this update that they've put together?
Man, I want to pass on that. Really, it's something that I haven't really processed yet. You know, I'm working night and day on Darkhaven, and I see this happen, and there's a lot of emotions, a lot of things going through my head, but kind of I have to put that aside just to keep going on what we're doing. So it does feel cool. I mean, you know, obviously we had a hand in making Diablo what it was, and it's great to see that people still love it and play it. But, you know, in terms of the specifics of like the Warlock and everything they've done, I think I still need to just like sit back someday and actually play it before I can have anything intelligible to say about the thing.
Hopefully once things calm down a bit, you know, with Darkhaven, you'll have a chance that you can stop and play some other games and check it out.
I haven't played it either. I remember back at Diablo 2 days, you know, the thought of doing another class was a really, really big event when we decided to do the expansion pack and like what those classes were going to be, and coming up with the assassin and the druid. Like there's so much, especially as a character artist, like there's so much creative expression that was available back then when we were working on the classes. You know, like the assassin was a specific thing I wanted to do because I was really into the kung fu movies and kind of chi power, psychic power kind of stuff. But you touched on recently, everybody wants an act, and I hadn't even considered an act. Like, classes have become one way that ARPGs easily produce more content. Like, we're doing a new class, right? So that's kind of a common thing that people see, and even new act content too. But the thought of Diablo 2 getting a new act kind of blew my mind when you said that, because I've always considered it as like, there's no way you could ever do that. How would you retcon all the lore that's happened since then? Where would it be? Would it be in a location that Diablo 3 or Diablo 4 is already fleshed out? But that got me thinking, like, wow, that would be incredible for Diablo 2. But yeah, I maybe have a little less feelings about it, because I worked on the expansion pack to get it started, and then I left, and it was super, super bittersweet and painful when that came out, because I just felt like, man, I wish I could have been there for a part of it. And I left voluntarily, but I still sort of really had my heart in it. And maybe that's where I made peace with, well, Diablo 2 is just going to be whatever it is. So I'm more just really, I'm anxious to play it. I think it's really cool. I think just having a new way to experience Diablo 2. I'm not a hardcore player though, so I'll just be casually bopping through the world.
I can understand from your point of view, where you guys made Diablo 2, you had a story you wanted to tell, you had content you want to make, you delivered that. And then the idea of me saying, oh, they could add another act, is you're thinking, well, the game was meant to have this much content. What do you mean just add another act? I think it's because, due to my live service history with Path of Exile, adding another act is exactly what we would do. And so, I think of games as perpetually expanding them, which, I mean, more recently, my thoughts have matured on this a little bit, that there is a lot of value to planning and scoping something out, putting it in a box and saying this is a complete product with intention behind it. And that's why I quite respect Diablo 2 for its current size. It doesn't have too much of anything, which I like quite a lot of. And I guess this is an interesting thing you guys will have to think about with, with Darkhaven, as it gets really popular, the extent to which, you intentionally expand the scope of the core game and how you handle players' ongoing, requirements for more content.
Yeah, for me, it's my first opportunity to really do that. All the games I've made, we sort of put them in a box and let them go, like you're saying. I think even though I wanted to keep going with the Torchlight 2, the rest of the team didn't, so I didn't get a chance. We didn't get a chance to keep improving and iterating on the game. So I'm excited to do that with Darkhaven. But yeah, I missed out on that before. I'm sure it's its own nightmare, which you're familiar with, and so I'll see how that plays out. But I like the idea right now.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that stuff, but it's rewarding, because it means that it's like making new games all the time. You get to work on something, release it, work on something and release it, and that's a very different feeling than working on something for 5 or 7 years before anyone gets to see it. Right.
Yeah, and I think for me, we always put so much work into these systems, the combat systems, and the economies, and the UI, UX, and then to just kind of toss it out and say, okay, what's the next game? Let's start from scratch. I'm like, but we've got these cool systems. They could just be iterated on for a long time. Let's just work with that. So I like the idea of the systems live on if we support it.
Yeah, the impression I get with the work you're doing on Darkhaven is that it's setting it up so that you can modularly add new content later. Like, you've spoken about modding tools and so on, and I imagine that not only benefits you guys as developers working on the game, making it really easy to add content now and later, but it also benefits the community if they want to add content in the same way.
Yeah, I think we're also trying some crazy new stuff with the terrain deformation and the altitude and stuff. So we're putting a lot of work into getting the system solid, the building blocks all made, and I feel like we're in good stead to just start dumping in content once we cross a couple more milestones here.
That's awesome. Well, I have a couple more questions about Diablo 2, mostly to satiate my passion for hearing about how it was made. One of the topics I'm really interested in, actually, is that because Diablo 2 was a 2D game, you had to render out these sprite sheets for everything in the game. And pretty much like every angle of every frame of every animation, and this would have only got more complicated due to like, stuff attached to characters' helmets and pauldrons and that kind of stuff. And I was wondering, like, I can imagine from my point of view what it would have been like to work on that, but you guys actually lived through this. So I was wondering, what are the biggest production bottlenecks in that workflow? And like, how does, now that you're working in modern 3D with Darkhaven, how does that make it easier or even harder?
Yeah, I remember we rendering out not only the cells from each direction of the characters, but we had to then hand cut them up so that the arms would be in the right place. The arms and the weapon would be in the right place versus the other little pieces. And it was a nightmare of just these giant sheets of multiple little pieces. It wasn't just the whole guy. We'd have to cut off the arms, cut off the head, kind of reattach them onto this, all by hand at first. And that was mostly me just kind of figuring it out how to do it at first, and organizing them in Photoshop. I'd make little errors that would screw up the whole thing. But then we got some decent tools to make it happen. And then we hired a friend of mine, Chris Root, to actually do all that work behind the scenes. But it took a lot of work. And it was just a lot of manpower. And then it was always touchy where it wasn't quite working out. We'd have to redo it, re-render out these sheets. So it's a whole new world today. I can't speak too much of the process anymore because, again, I've gotten out of the art side of things and just into the design. But it seems like things happen a lot faster nowadays.
I mean, the Diablo 2, what Eric's talking about was probably more Diablo 1. By the time I got there, I mean, that was I lived that for 3 years. And, we weren't dealing with individual sprite sheets by that point. We had file formats that would pack them into we never dealt with the sprite sheets. We had a tool where you would render it out. And there was a plugin inside of 3D Studio Max that would render it out to this 24-bit format. And then there was an offline process that would come up with an optimal palette from the 24-bit source art and re-render it as an 8-bit game file. And these were the individual, it was a sprite sheet behind the scenes, but we had a viewer so we could look at each individual part for each frame of every angle. And then the hand work that we had to do was for every frame of every angle, we had to order all the components for each character. Wow. So we'd have the right and left hands, which included the weapons, and we have the arms, the shoulder pads, the pauldrons, the torso, the legs. I think the legs were just one piece. We had the head, and then there were a couple little add-on bits that we added here and there. And we could copy like the ordering, so you'd kind of set the order for one direction and then just paste it for the whole animation and then play back through it. And like if the hand went behind, you'd have to flip the hand behind here. And there was a lot of, that didn't always work because you'd have a component that should be in the front and behind. So we had a matte material also that we could put on, say, the head. And that would, when the hand would go behind the head, it would just make that hand disappear for that frame. Mm. And it didn't always perfectly line up because the head could be different sizes. So, if you really looked at the art closely, you could probably see places where it was overlapping, but everything was moving really quickly. So you didn't really get to see it. But I remember thinking, even at the time, like that this is probably the last and most complicated sprite 2D game that's ever going to be made, because it felt like there was no way we could push the technology any further than what we were pushing it. And the file sizes were getting really significant. Like one character would be like 150 megabytes, which was huge back then, so we were trying to figure out how many CD-ROMs we could ship it on. And we had the act that would take up a lot of the artwork too, but it was cool to figure that out, but it was a lot of work. If we ever wanted to add, that was the limitation. That's why we could only have 3 sets of armor, and we would just mix and match the pieces of each armor for the inventory item. And we did palletization. Yeah, it was easily the most complicated. Well, I don't know. Maybe there were more complicated sprite games, but
But we came up with the whole scheme as kind of trial and error. We had to invent it. There were no.
Yeah. It was some of that was in place when I got there, and I was the only one who knew 3D Studio Max at the point, so that's kind of why I became de facto lead artist, because I was sort of teaching people how to use Character Studio and 3D Studio Max, and those tools were developing, as we were working. But the Amazon was already partly made when I got there, but the Corrupt Rogues were actually the first character that was put through this whole pipeline, and they were kind of the test bed for this all working. And they were over engineered, the Corrupt Rogues. They had, they themselves had 3 different armor sets. They had the light, medium, and heavy, tentacle levels, and they also had all their weapons. Spent a long time just on the Corrupt Rogues, but then, we knew that the Amazon was ready to go.
What Phil said actually reminded me of a small tidbit that you might find interesting. So I think Diablo 2 shipped on 6 CDs, something like that. It was big, right? It was actually costly to manufacture. But what we ended up doing in order to fit all of that art onto the 6 CDs is we lowered the quality of all of the characters. Like, we compressed them all. And so we actually had high-res versions of all of the characters, like higher res, higher color fidelity. And I don't think we ever shipped it. And I believe it was completely lost to time, sitting in a junkyard somewhere.
Yeah, those 24-bit source files, there were DH5s, which was the 24-bit ones, and then DC5s, which were I don't know what that stood for, but that was and then we did a 16-bit version. Was that the expansion pack that had the 16-bit rendering, or was that was only in the 3D? The 3D was rendering it in 16-bit, but it was still using.
What I'm saying is that we actually cut it down from there, like at the very end, just to fit it all on the CDs.
It wasn't even 8-bit sprites at that point?
No, not even 8-bit.
That is fascinating. I have 100 questions about this. And I mean, even the palletization stuff, like my understanding with Diablo 2 is that you had a palette per act. When I forced a Diablo 2 client between acts, I noticed the palette is scrambled for the terrain stuff, but it's consistent for characters and inventory and so on. So that means you would have had to have some budget out of your 256 colors to allocate to environment, and the math required to work that out correctly, and then the stuff it restricts you from doing in a given act. Like if you've got a very yellow and brown act 2, you couldn't have a pink area because there's just no palette budget available for it.
There was reserved areas for characters, reserved areas for UI, and reserved areas for background, and they could borrow. And at several points along the way, I mean, it was really cool the way that, I guess it was mostly Dave that set this up, is that if we ever added a lot of new content, the backgrounds were usually this way, because when we'd start an act, we didn't have anything, there wasn't anything to palletize, right? So we just they would go ahead and build out Loot Ghislaine and build out, a lot of Act 2. And then we would do a repalletization. So we just run it through all the 24-bit sources, and it would come up with a new optimized palette. And we could lock certain colors, I think, don't change these, like for the UI for sure, and for the characters. But I think even then we could, and want to make sure you have a ramp, because we were doing lighting, right? So you're not only trying to reserve the colors, but you're trying to reserve enough values for each color so that there was a ramp, and you could light it, or at least approximate the lighting. But sometimes we do that palette and everything would look kind of weird. It's like, okay, so we got to get in there and figure out how to artificially give it more of this color or less of this color, so it doesn't over index for a certain thing, or there's a really important red or something in the environment and it wasn't really in the source very far, so we have to specifically say no, carve out this red so that that's going to show up.
Yeah, I remember explicitly saying, hey, we got to have some reds to get the blood to show up right. I guess it probably needed it for the monoball too. I think that was Mike O'Brien from Blizzard, went on to ArenaNet and everything. He came up with a palette scheme, this idea of how he could do a dynamic palette based on the levels we made. It took him a little while to sell us, but then we had to iterate with him to reserve these ramps and the for the character stuff. it was a neat process, and it came out really, really good because the game looks a lot richer than just an 8-bit game. Dude,
Stephen Wu actually ended up implementing it for Diablo 2 after consulting with Mike. Yeah.
What I'm noticing here is that in Diablo 2, you broke significant technical ground, like the BattleNet as well, right? Like there's, the random level generation. Pretty much every area of the game was years ahead of the competition, which is why the game is, so crazily impactful. But I'm noticing that on Darkhaven, you're also taking on hard technical challenges, right? Like the terrain destruction stuff. I mean, that's not easy, like Minecraft made billions from doing that and they're popularizing it. And it was a very hard technical challenge. And, you're rolling that into like what people may not understand when they're evaluating this is it's okay, cool. Making, terrain destruction is hard, but then doing it in a consistent multiplayer environment, like this stuff needs to be serialized. There is like, it's got to be represented in memory. You've got a huge world. You're changing parts of it. There's all this stuff here. And like, you're taking on incredibly hard technical challenges so that you can have a game that's years ahead of the competition. Is this intentional? Like, is it your game plan of just solve all the hard stuff like no one else can do?
I mean, I think it's just something naturally that we try to do based off of what we want to do for the game, right? Like we get all these ideas and we're like, how do you implement it? How do you make it happen? Darkhaven actually has a completely different network infrastructure and architecture than we've ever used before in an ARPG. And there's so much more, like people being able to edit online, live, collaboratively worlds. I mean, I don't think anyone's doing that, but it's just so fun to like think of these systems and implement them. So yeah, and then they add to the game.
We don't try to make it hard on ourselves, but what we have. I think it's just the fun of the challenge to keep development fresh. I mean, I'm getting to be an old guy, but I still every day, just love to think about what we're going to tinker on, how we're going to make these things work. So I think kind of has to be complex for me to be really interested in working on it. And then Peter obviously loved this stuff too, so we have a great time.
When we started, I remember, Peter talking about what he wanted to do on the engine side of it. And it was a very specific decision to make it, it's effectively a 2D engine, really. Like we have height, but, everything is on a grid. And I mean, Peter would be the guy to explain it, but the way I understand, the way he explained it to me is you get vastly more efficient servers that way, because we're really not, it's not like a 3D world where you have to track the X, Y, Z position of everything. And the server isn't running Unity at all. It doesn't know anything, that it doesn't even know it's a 3D world. It just knows that it's a grid and things are moving on the grid and you have a position on the grid.
No, that's all wrong now.
Well,
that's not what we're doing. No, we're not doing that. It's 3D.
Well, why can't you go over things then?
I mean, there's limitations on the pathfinding that we haven't implemented yet in terms of, pathing in 3D can be hard, right? And so we haven't done that. And there's aspects of it that are a little bit 2D, but the world itself is fully 3D. Like we track of everything in 3D. All of the terrain is tracked. You can jump over missiles and, we track like what you hit where. And so it's pretty much a full 3D engine.
Okay.
With like a couple limitations that we're probably going to solve before the end of the project.
Now, Peter, correct me. I'm with Phil. I kind of think of it as 2D. Do we get efficiency or something? Don't we do like for each XY position in the world? Isn't there a stack of like 8 types of rock and then 4 types of dirt? Is there an efficiency?
No, it's not like that. No, it's really funny that we're talking about this now. But yeah, I mean, we can have unlimited different types of strata like stacked on top of each other, and we track all of it. There's efficiency, like for an isometric game primarily, and also just in terms of human like visualization of the world, right? Like in terms of spatial partitioning, there's definitely efficiencies you get in terms of like, we're not making a space game, right? We're not like spaceships aren't like in every single possible direction from each other in full 3D or whatever. So like the world itself, like we encode it in a way that is optimized for like sort of an isometric experience, like a real world on the ground experience, right? There's certain optimizations in how we represent the world in that regard. And we take advantage of that. But that doesn't mean that the actual representation of the world isn't full 3D. And the servers are doing all of the 3D math that makes that happen.
The explanation Phil gave of his impression of how it worked is like basically exactly how it works, and say Path of Exile has an evolution of the way it works in Diablo 2. So that would have been my guess as well as to how it worked, except behind the scenes you added a third dimension. Yeah, I am impressed at the amount of technical challenge that you're undertaking, because the work you've done there in order to properly represent the 3D will, once you get 3D pathfinding and stuff, probably let you do some really cool stuff that a lot of other action RPGs just don't allow.
Yeah, and just the real-time nature of it is really cool too. And we didn't actually start off wanting to make the game like deformable terrain. We started off wanting to make an editor, an online editor, where you could edit the terrain the same way you would in like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft, any of those editors, like the most recent editors that, but Erich got there and he was like, well, why can't I do this stuff? I mean, I'm doing it in real time in the editor anyway. Why can't I just do it in the game? And so we just started pushing the game, and it was really cool. I think it's not like finely tuned yet, right? Like there's definitely people where it's like, oh, this is a little bit janky. But it's the very beginning of the game in that respect, and we have a lot of time to polish it up until it's just really good.
Yeah, I've been impressed with the bones. I played an early version of the demo last year that Phil shared with me, and the bones that it has in terms of technical underpinnings and capabilities were very impressive. Obviously, most people don't see game demos that early. Like normally, in a regular game development cycle, company will sit on its secrets and polish the thing to be very consumable before people play it. So this is a great opportunity for the public to see a game that's at a much earlier stage in its development than they otherwise would see, which is a really cool insight that they get. But I greatly enjoyed my time with the demo, and actually credit to Erich here as well, that the thing that hooked me in was the Diablo 2ization of the item system, or the remnants of that that shone through. I felt when I was playing it, wow, this feels like home in terms of itemization, and that wasn't something I was expecting, because normally when people share demos of action RPGs with me, I'm so picky, about that kind of stuff, that I only have 100 bits of criticism about itemization and various other feel factors. But in this case, we could tell that you were involved, which was very cool.
Thanks for saying that, but really, Peter deserves the credit here on the itemization. I mean, we talk about it a lot, and I offer my opinion on a lot of things. But he started the systems, sold me on them when I didn't agree. I wanted to push it in the ways I usually think about these things. But this is the first game where I would say I'm not leading the itemization, and it's Peter's baby. I think he thinks about it all the time. So, and I agree, he's doing an excellent job. And again, just laying the groundwork for where we go from here. We're in great shape with that respect.
That's cool. Yeah, I have noticed, Peter, that you've been talking a lot about itemization on the Reddit post you made. So I should have inferred that, but I assumed from Erich handling a lot of that on Diablo 2 that it was his hand at work there.
I mean, his hand's definitely in it, because he's constantly giving feedback, right, and tuning. Like that's his superpower, is constantly playing the game over and over again and fine-tuning the things. So even though I might have designed some of the systems early on, they're fine-tuned by Erich in a lot of ways.
Yeah, fair enough. I actually have a question for you, Peter. Going back to Diablo 2 stuff very slightly, my understanding is that you were primarily the driving force behind the 1.10 patch for Diablo 2. I mean, I've heard people describe it to me as you're the sole person sitting there writing it yourself, but I understand there probably would have been other support infrastructure within Blizzard. As a really active 1.09 player at the time, the idea of getting such a substantial update for Diablo 2 released was a huge deal to me and my friends. Like the fact that 1.10 was being made was just this extra gift that we received, and we kind of got it out of nowhere. And so there's a lot of players who would want to personally thank you for delivering that update. But do you have any a brief story about how it came about? What was happening behind the scenes then?
I mean, there's also players that would want to kick me for that update, but yeah, I know it's a mixed bag. I was actually pretty much the only developer working on any of the patches after 107, which was the LED patch. Pretty much we had crunched just I was working 100-hour weeks for years on just to get D2 and LOD out the door. And I don't think anyone had much appetite to continue working on it except for me. And so, yeah, I mean, I just loved the thing and kept working and wanted to see it being supported. I was still new at the time in some ways, and so I made mistakes in the 110 design that I wouldn't repeat. Like, I know, like, some of the rune words weren't well balanced, and, synergies were probably a mistake in many ways. But, it was a different time. Like, there was no QA. I pretty much got Julian Love and Wyatt Chang to play whatever I did because they were new. And I knew they were hardcore D2 players. So I was just like, hey, try this out, give me some feedback. And yeah, I mean, it was a weird process. I think at the time I had sort of established myself as someone that, Dave, Max, and Eric could at least trust a little bit. And they gave me free reign to do what I want. And what I wanted to do was at least half my time spent on supporting D2. And so that's what I did. Yeah, and I really wanted D2 to be moddable. I really saw a lot in Warcraft and Starcraft and how custom games kept those franchises going. So I made a lot of changes to make that happen. And yeah, it's weird. There's no PTRs. There was a lot less support infrastructure than you would think. I think I had Matt Householder and Christian Erich supporting me as producers on it. But yeah, and of course there's the BattleNet team. I didn't do everything. Brian Fitzgerald, who's on our team now at Darkhaven and was like director of technology at Blizzard from almost like original Warcraft to Overwatch, was supporting me a lot from the sort of the BattleNet side of just the database type stuff. I think he implemented like the rest storm and things like that. So yeah, but it was weird because I was halfway through 110 when Dave, Max, and Eric just came in, called the studio meeting, said that they were leaving, and it was just like that day, like right after they gave that speech to the studio, and everyone was in shock. I just went up and I said, I'm going with you. Whatever you guys do, just take me with you. But I still had to finish 110, and I didn't want to leave like the community that I've been communicating with the whole time. I didn't want to like leave without giving them, what we talked about. And so I ended up staying like, I think at least 6 months to just finish 110. I don't think my heart was in it at the time, but it was just something like I felt I had to do. And then, as soon as that thing shipped, I was out the door and joined Flagship to make Hellgate.
Given that 110 opened the doors to so much modding capability for Diablo II, and how over the last 20 years between now and then, much of the community's enjoyment of Diablo II has been through mods, I think the work you put in there was very appreciated. Even if, you feel that some of the rune words or synergies weren't quite perfect, the, 90% of people's playtime in terms of the enduring legacy of the game has been in the wide variety of mods that you enabled. So that was a decision that really helped the action RPG genre, right? Like a lot of stuff is innovated through mods, and that's, I guess, a good segue into the modding stuff with Darkhaven, because you've been quite outspoken that that's a thing that's very important to your team. I guess, to what extent did you learning about facilitating modding with Diablo 2 help the way you've structured it with Darkhaven?
Actually, not too much. I mean, Diablo 2 wasn't meant to be modded. And so anything I did for patch 110 was really just like hacking it in many ways. I learned a lot more about modding actually from paying attention to Warcraft and Starcraft, which were, built to be modded. And so I think a lot of our decisions around how to make things moddable probably draw more inspiration from those games than they do Diablo 2. I think Diablo 2 does have one part to play, which is that the database of items and skills and monsters is enormous compared to what you would normally see in a like a Starcraft or a Warcraft mod, or like at least a typical one. And some of the mods, like there are mods out there for D2 that have like well over 1 million recipes, like for cube recipes, right? So it's like that part of it, in terms of being able to support like data manipulation for modders, being able to wrangle that much data, I think is something that we've learned from D2 and want to be able to support, with Darkhaven.
With regard to the way that modding works, and this is going to be a little bit complicated, you guys will have to explain to me. So my understanding is the multiplayer model in Darkhaven is that there are large shards that you can play on publicly for players who want to have bustling, interaction with other players, but that an individual player or streamer or community can run their own shard. And these shards are all hosted on your authoritative servers to prevent cheating. So it's not like I can run it on my computer and fiddle with the memory and that kind of stuff. And so you have server authority, but it's split into several different independent games. And those games could have separate rules. Does this mean that you can run a mod as one of the shards?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we let people mod online, so that they can mod our servers, which is actually an insane thing if you think about it. Like, just the implications of that and the technical challenges that we have to solve to allow that to happen is pretty crazy. But yeah, I mean, we want people to be able to create persistent online mods of Darkhaven, run them, and let people actually network mods together, work on mods collaboratively, let characters travel between mods if the operators of the mods or the admins of the mods or the mod servers or whatever you want to call it allow. And yeah.
I have a lot of technical and business questions about this. It's quite unique. Like, I get, games like Minecraft, for example, have modding and so on, but Minecraft servers aren't run authoritatively by a trusted developer. They're run just on random Linux machines that kids have spooled up on the internet, which means that there could be hacking and duping and stuff like that that isn't policed as well as you guys will be able to do. And I firmly believe that the thing that's very important to many action RPG players is playing on an economy which validates progress, right? Like, you want to be there for when an economy starts and push really hard to get the good items and get the levels before other people, knowing that the server is validating the fact you didn't cheat to do that. We see this with Diablo and Path of Exile, like ladder resets, where you get a lot of people turning up to play because they get to demonstrate their mastery of the game and skill at it in an environment where they couldn't just fake that. And so doing this on the server, of course, is the correct way to do it, I feel. Now, there's a lot of questions here, right? Like, I mean, there's business questions about how, like, for example, how are you monetizing mods? Is this a thing where, like, creators who have mods are going to get a share of that money? And if so, are you covering the server costs of running these mods? What if the mods consume a lot of resources? If I make a mod that spawns 1 million zombies, what's policing that? There's so many questions here.
Yeah, so already, we have like a basic editor that ships with the demo. So you can actually go in, check it out. People have spawned like 100 instances of the boss, like Narlebak is the boss, has the most complicated AI, the most skills or whatever, and they can just like plop them down. They're all running on our server. And actually the server has been much more performant than we actually anticipated at the beginning, even though we haven't optimized it as much as we could. Every single person that's playing the demo right now, at least online, are playing on a single home computer, like the servers on a home computer in someone's house, and it's working. I mean, it's probably has very little utilization even now. So that's cool.
You haven't done like a large cloud rollout to support this. You've got
Not at all. Yeah.
That's impressive. It performs well.
It's, like I said, totally new network architecture. We have people playing all over the world. One of Erich's friends was playing from Japan and said he was playing online and didn't even notice lag at all. Like, we really wanted this. We really designed this network architecture to reduce like the feeling of latency when you're playing the game, and I think it's done its job like better than we had even hoped. And also, it's really easy to like program for it. Like, it's almost like you're making a single player game. So a lot of the cost, like the development costs of building content, is lessened with what we're doing. So once we start building content, it'll be really easy, and we'll have like less bugs and less you don't have gameplay programmers having to know exactly how to write like client server code. So a lot of this is just stuff that has been like, you know, we've been thinking about for a really long time, like working on all these ARPGs that we've been working on, like a lot of the technical team anyway, over the years. And so, yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool stuff. I mean, in terms of business, I think, of course, it's possible for a mod maker to create a mod that overutilizes CPU, like way beyond what I've described. And if that's the case, yeah, we do plan on having monetization models similar to like Roblox or whatever, where mod makers can monetize their mod with like an in-game currency. And I think like we haven't gotten to this point yet, but I think if a mod maker does something really crazy, we'll probably just end up at that point being like, okay, your mod is too crazy. We're going to limit it unless you want to pay us, some fees to cover the cost of compute.
The business model stuff is kind of up in the air. I think we're super flexible in the design, but then we can make limitations as we decide how we're actually going to fully monetize all those decisions. Also, you mentioned ladders and season type stuff. I'm sure we will have some way to mark characters as pure, as our rule set only, and haven't been tainted by some kind of treasure mod where they just hop into the world and somebody gives them all the loot in the world or whatever. So we'll be able to restrain things in a lot of ways. We're just building it super wide open and haven't picked out those ways yet.
One of the things that between Blizzard and Moonbeast, at every company I was at, I started noticing. I mean, even at Flagship, we were noticing this, but just started noticing where new game genres were coming from, and where like innovation was coming from. And I think it was at Kabam where a couple of us sat down and really made a business case and like looked at all the data and historically saw like where there were big shifts in the expansion of a genre. And some of it was like there's a new platform, like a new Nintendo console comes out and Mario Kart comes out, and if you consider Mario Kart a racing game, like the total racing genre just went bloop. It's all because of this new game that came out. But a lot of the times it was from a mod, like you would have Half-Life, and Counter-Strike, and we all saw what happened with Dota and that turned into League of Legends. I was at Gravity Bear when the designer who was working for me, actually Peter's brother, Alan, we were trying to figure out what game we were going to make, and what game we were going to pitch. And he came in and he was talking about this mod that he was playing on Warcraft 3. And it was like, there's lanes and they got these creeps that are coming down the lanes and you have to pick a hero and you go down and it just sounded so weird and specific and kind of like, I don't really, what's the big picture? You just keep doing this over and over again. It's like, okay, I don't know. And we played it and I was like, okay, this is kind of fun. Maybe let's try to prototype something. We'll try to prototype our own version of this. And in the middle of doing that, it was announced that Riot got funding and they were going to build their own version of this. And, it was kind of like one of those other, so many times in my career, I'm sure in all of our careers, right? We have an idea and we think it's the best idea in the world. And then lo and behold, somebody else is already building it. But that idea that a genre tends to stagnate. I mean, MOBAs turned out to be perfect for the genre because RTSs were not the best esports model. There was a lot of problems with RTSs as a esports for the masses, and to really popularize it. But just organically, modders came up with this solution that was way more friendly to watch. There were shorter matches. It was more exciting. There was more back and forth. You almost losing and then you turn it around and then you come back, and that rarely happens in an RTS. So just organically, the community came up with this game genre that no publisher or designer or studio, no publisher or studio ever would have taken a gamble on. It's just too weird and specific. But modding is doing this all the time. Like modding is all the time expanding the genre, creating a new thing out of something that was there that just seems, and at the time it seems like it came out of nowhere. But if you look back at it historically, it's like, oh, it makes perfect sense. So that was when we started Peter was talking about making a moddable ARPG at Flagship, and that didn't get off the ground. But when we joined up again to talk about what we wanted to do at Moonbeast, that was front and center. And a core idea was that ARPGs are really difficult to make. It's a big investment. There hasn't been a lot of innovation in ARPGs, like big innovations on the order of magnitude of what, MOBA was to the RTS. And so if we can create a platform that allows people to really experiment with all the systems and the gear and the mechanics and the online persistence and the economies, with all that ARPG stuff out of the way, we might be able to capture the MOBA equivalent of the ARPG, like the next big weird innovation. And so that's why we want to keep those modders incentivized to stay on our platform, like they can make money doing it. Blizzard, I believe that I've heard this, from, I don't know if culturally they know this, but like they missed out on that because, the modders couldn't make money on the back of Battle.net. They were competing with Blizzard, or Blizzard saw it that way. At least that's my understanding of it. So they went off and started a new company. So Peter mentioned Roblox, right? If we can capture those modders and get them to stay on our platform and, make money on our platform or build their communities on our platform, that's kind of the big picture. It is the big picture. That's the big vision. We want to make a game. We want to make it fun. We want to make it because we love this game and we want it to just be fun out of the gate. But we're really looking forward to what people do with it when we start to really flesh out those tools. And we think there's some really exciting ideas that nobody's thought of yet that might come out of this.
I'm sorry. Just when I'm playing, I think of other kind of games we can make with the engine here. Like, just one of the fun things to do early on was I would just fire fireballs across this chasm and destroy the other side of the chasm. I was thinking you could just like make a Castle Siege game where it's just one guy versus the other firing these fireballs to destroy the other guy's terrain. And so it's kind of easy when I play to imagine different games based on our exact engine here.
It occurs to me that even aside from monetizing the mods, there are other benefits to supporting it, right? Like from your point of view, if there's a popular mod, people then have to buy your game in order to play that mod. Like if the new Dota spawns from Darkhaven, then people may be buying it to play that rather than the core rules if it happens to be so sticky and viral. And then the other thing, of course, is while it's great for creators to earn money, even if they don't earn money, this is a platform that supports persistence and multiplayer, which are both incredibly hard to spool up in their little Unity project. Like, yeah, they could make their game rules in Unity, but then they don't exactly get the ability to deploy that at scale. And that takes millions of dollars of effort to develop. And you've already done that and are providing that to them. And when you think about it, like game development tools usually cost more than $40 to buy, right? Like this is actually a pretty good deal, for its versatility, compared to the significant costs of actually paying for the proper, Unity and Unreal stuff of what it ends up costing.
It's very difficult to write those systems too. Like the first thing anybody ever wants to make, it seems like when a new moddable game comes out is an RPG, and it's hard because if you really start to especially do the itemizations and the between session persistence and all that, it's just it's hard to stand that up.
Yep.
Can we get Chris to help come on as like chief marketing officer or something like that?
Very happy to give you some free marketing advice, but I think you guys have this sort of. You've been in the industry a lot longer than I have. Yeah. So I have a question here. I was rereading Erich's postmortem of Diablo II, as I do. You wrote like 25 years ago an article before LOD came out. It's on like gamedeveloper.com or something. And in there you mentioned that you felt that the tooling for Diablo II was separate from the game, and that if you could go back in time, you would have integrated the tooling with the game. So my question here is, with Darkhaven, it feels and sounds like you have integrated all the tooling with the game client. Is that the case, and what benefits are you seeing from that?
Yeah, for sure. Diablo 2 had, for me as a designer, remarkably terrible tools. I couldn't even like edit data. I had to just like suggest, literally hand people paper, reduce this guy's hit points to this, do that. There was no in-game tools. There was no read from Excel is the obvious thing I wanted people to do. We didn't even have that. So the tools were just terrible. The turnover time for me to iterate was at best 1 day on these things. Instead of like right now, I could try 100 different values in Darkhaven, which I'm sure, though, this is pretty common. We had it much better by the Torchlight days, and since, and I'm sure you had much better tools than we had back then. So it isn't that radical, but the idea that I can just keep adjusting the run speed just while I'm playing is remarkable advance. But I feel like most of that advance actually did happen with Hellgate and then the Torchlight for me. And I suspect everybody's working with better tools these days.
Yeah, I think the big difference here is that you can do it in a multiplayer game, right? Like you could actually get a couple people in and start like tweaking values and making stuff and having it work, which is I think the big thing that Darkhaven is adding.
Yeah. And also non-trivial, yet another hard technical task you've undertaken.
And yet it's working pretty well. People right now they have editor wars where they spawn up big towers and try to pour lava into the other guy's lands. So what's kind of one thing that immediately comes to mind is, hey, if you can do this in the editor, why don't we make a skill that does this in game? Mm-hmm. Because so that's trying to inform how we've gone about this, and I think it'll help.
Yeah. The editor lets you see what's actually really fun to play with, and then that's a toy you can add to the palette in game.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool.
I found it's a lot of fun to just run around in the world, find a location, and you think, this would look better if I did this or whatever. And we don't really have the loop right now to do all that and save it out as a preset. We kind of do, but we don't have a way to, as a designer and artist to say, okay, now spawn this preset in these worlds with these rules. But the editor is so easy to use. You're not fiddly, snapping things together or whatever. You're just kind of painting, and we're not the only editor that does that, but it's very fun to just make the world more beautiful and come up with little scenes and little encounter areas and things like that.
So a topic that I've been thinking about a bit recently is I feel there's a spectrum with action RPGs where the genre came from turn-based games, like pre-Diablo 1. And in that game, the way combat works is you allocate your points in your character, you decide what skills you're using, and then the math calculates how well combat goes. You, as a player, just select your target and, it's turn-based. There's no timing or anything like that. And Diablo 1's innovation was that now there is timing, now there is positioning and movement, and it's a bit real-time. But still, most of the calculations are the result of like whether your character has enough strength and dexterity and so on. And a lot of action RPGs work like that, where the fantasy is that it's the character that you are investing in. The character is the skilled warrior who's doing the stuff, and you, as a regular person at home, aren't capable of fighting to the same extent the character can. And I think I've been noticing in more recent modern action RPGs, like, Diablo 4, Path of Exile 2, and so on, is that they start to include more kind of Twitch-based your skill matters kind of stuff. Like there's dodge rolls and telegraphed attack areas, and it's a case where you, as a player, have to actually be more dexterous than you otherwise would do if you were merely issuing instructions. And so there's a spectrum where on one hand you have a fantasy of the character is skilled, and on the other hand you have a fantasy of my player skill matters more. And everything exists on the spectrum. Like even in Diablo 2, you can still run around away from enemies, and that does matter a bit. But, there's hit chance, there's dexterity, and that kind of stuff. You put points in dodge, evade, avoid as an Amazon, rather than dodging, evading, and avoiding as much as a player. And I've noticed with Darkhaven, because of the 3D terrain and because of the ability to jump and stuff, there is a large amount of player expression there with regard to the ability to weave in and out of combat. And I wanted to know, is this intentional? Like, is the goal here that you have a more, like a player-driven kind of combat system than some of the more traditional turn-based like ones?
I don't know if it's the intention. In my mind, my balance, my rule of thumb is always it's 1/3 player skill, 1/3 skill build and 1/3 loot contributes to your success. And to be a great player, you got to do all three. But really, even doing one is okay. One of my secrets in ARPGs is that you always win, right? No matter what you do, you're going to win the game. It's kind of, we don't like to say that too much out loud because it doesn't sound like people do anything. Of course, there's competitive and good players and stuff, but no one fails at Diablo 2. Everyone's going to succeed. And really, I think the path to success is you learn the systems, you learn the builds, or you just keep earning the loot, or you're a good player. All those will work, all of them together to be a great player. But I find that in Darkhaven still I could play that way. I could just be lazy, play it one-handed, I just take it a little slower, and I got some good loot that drives it. Or I could push. I'm pretty good at it right now, obviously. I play it a lot. I could push the skill angle, a couple of levels ahead, so I'm fighting higher level monsters just by jumping and kiting to some degree. Now, that only gets you so far. So to be really good at it, you got to kind of master all three of those. Loot and stats, I kind of combine together. And I say 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I don't know if that's the case, but that's how I always think about it in my head. So, and try to make it so it's not totally player skill dependent. It's not totally loot dependent. And not totally build dependent. This is the way I approach that. And I think I'm sticking with that same thing in Darkhaven. It might be a little more actiony than the old days, than Diablo 2, but not too much. Diablo 2, even though you say that, there's a lot of position-y stuff that comes into play, especially early and mid-game. Later on, and these days, there's more, the clear the screen all the time of every monster as you kind of just hover through. It gets a little different, and the end game of Diablo was like that too, I think, to some degree. And we don't really have that right now, but I anticipate we'll probably end up a little bit more like that towards our end game too.
Would you say, Eric, that the player skill, you did say this, but like player skill, you can never win the game completely with player skill, and that's true for every ARPG. That's the formula, but the player skill lets you get a little bit. There's kind of the high performance part of the graph and the low performance part of the graph. And the player skill, can kind of make up this delta, the space between the two lines. So you can push a little bit further ahead, but at some point you'll hit a wall in just the difficulty of the monsters and the inadequacy of your loot and your level. But it's rewarding as a player to feel like, hey, I'm good. I can get a little bit further. And that's, I'm not at that level of play, but, when you watch the really competitive ARPG players talk about it, it's like they want to feel like their skill matters. And when it doesn't matter in a game where, you just have to do everything by the numbers and it has to be a specific build in order to beat a boss or beat an encounter, then it's really boring. That's...
Yeah, I don't know if there was a question there still.
No, I'm just kind of...
Right. But that's how I think about it. Yeah, you can push it in any number of ways. You can push it temporarily with a really good drop. You push it temporarily with a great skill build combo, and really know what you're doing. Oh, this is the way to really get this build. Or push it temporarily with player skill. Also, kind of makes long fights that might be long boss fights a little more fun if you can overpower it in one of those dimensions, I feel like.
Yeah, you have to feel like you're cheating the system at least a little bit, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love it when players are like, you've made this way overpowered, but then it turns out, in a level or two, whatever they're complaining about kind of doesn't become that important anymore. Or they're struggling really hard and I think this game's impossible. But all of a sudden, one drop or a new skill or figuring something out, a new technique, those put them over. And so I just love the up and down, spiky balance.
Fair enough. So the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is another business one, is funding. And obviously games of the scope cost a lot of money to make. This is a complicated game. There's a lot of content. It's being made by industry experts. It's, it's going to have some budget behind it, and I'm sure you've already spent a lot of money on it. And one thing that the audience may not appreciate is how bad a state the games industry is in with regard to funding over the last couple of years. Like, I've had 10, 12 times in the last couple of years, people have come to me and said, hey, Chris, I've got this studio. Look, I've got a game and I am not having any luck finding funding. Can you help out? And I think the reason they're approaching me is because I know Tencent well, and I know other investors, and, there's the possibility that I can introduce them to someone who can help. And I've dutifully introduced them, and, demos have been shown and that kind of thing. And out of all of those people, 0 have received $1. And I don't know of a case, literally, I don't know of any case of anyone in the games industry getting any money for their games from traditional investment, like, investment and publishing routes. Whereas in the past, during the high point in the cycles, some companies are closing a deal a day with games. Publishers are signing everyone. Like during COVID, when gaming was incredibly hot, obviously, like there was money being thrown around in vast amounts. And I suspect this is all getting sucked up with the AI bubble at the moment, and, all the money's heading in that direction. But the reality is it's very hard to raise money for projects, and I'm sure this has affected you guys. So you're running a Kickstarter at the moment, and I kind of wanted to ask, like, how has it gone? How did you get here? And what are your thoughts on funding?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, right? The funding is, and all of the game developer friends in, my community are in the same boat. It's the same experience. It's very, very difficult to raise money. And even 4 or 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. Maybe between 10 years ago and 3 years ago, it was a gold rush of investment into game studios, the AA and, whatever you want to call those studios, that high profile, big investments in studios that were founded on the promise of, we're going to be the next Blizzard, or we're going to be the next Riot, or, the next Valve. And a lot of that hasn't come to pass. And that's part of, I think, the reason why the money went elsewhere. Like you said, AI is also the new bubble, the new hot thing to invest in. And unfortunately, we as a studio missed out. You're just a little too late to capitalize on that. We were able to get some funding a while ago. We talked about our seed round that we got because 1AM and a couple of other investors believed in us and saw our vision and were willing to support it. But the amount of money that has gone into Darkhaven and Moonbeast is pale in comparison to, what a lot of other high profile studios have been operating on. And the fact that we've gotten as far as we've gotten is really 100% a testament to the team. This is a very small team. We're running very lean. We've put some amount of our own money into it, proportionately a lot of money, because none of us are independently wealthy. And, the team has been working under, it's been a passion project for everybody. And so, yeah, we found ourselves with a game that is nearly ready to show people. This is at the end of last year. We did a streamer demo in August. That went over really well. We had a play test before that. That went over really well. And it was the first time we let anybody outside of the studio seriously, in volume, play the game. And they all really liked it. And we got really, really positive feedback, especially from streamers who had never even played the game. People like Riker and Mr. Llama have always been supporters of us, and they knew what we were building. But then you get Zizarin and others that have really no idea what we were building and played it for the first time and just like, oh my God, this is amazing. So that was really, really confidence boosting to us. And we thought, okay, let's, we have to start showing this to people, because we have to figure out where the rest of the money is going to come from. And that's when we decided that we were going to put out a demo and we were going to participate in Next Fest. And then we would just do a Kickstarter. We had put off doing a Kickstarter for a long time because it's not really, there's pluses and minuses to Kickstarter, and Kickstarter has obviously been very volatile in the games industry. There's been a lot of high profile failures or just, not good outcomes. And, we don't want to ask players for money. We don't want to ask them to take a risk on something, it's inherently risky. We feel like we're a really good bet because we know our capabilities and we know what we can build and we know what we're, intending to build. But it's still, it's like, this is people's hard-earned money. But, we had a lot of people in our community saying, how do I pre-order this? How do I give you money? And the fact that people were liking the game, that became our best option, and still is our best, most immediate option for getting funding. We're still talking to everybody that we can talk to. I'll be at GDC talking to publishers and everybody. The thing that we have now that we didn't have before is we have a game that people are playing, and we've got a number of wish lists, and it's going really well. And that hopefully will make the difference. And if we have a successful Kickstarter, that's another big vote of confidence. So I think one thing players and, non-developers might not know is that something like Kickstarter, it's partly about the money, right? It will help us develop the game, and 100% of the money goes towards the development of the game. We're not, there's no extravagant expenses in this studio. We work at home and we just, take the money, we spend the money exactly where we need to spend it. But it's also a big vote of confidence. So when investors and publishers see that people are willing to pay for the game in the current state, that's really confidence boosting. It gives them confidence that everything is working. So that's why we're asking the community, hey, if you like what you see and if you believe in what we're doing and you can afford it, we will gratefully and humbly welcome you to walk alongside us as we build this thing. And that just gives us an audience that's really committed, that can give us feedback. So yeah, that's a lot of words about it, but yeah, it's a tough time, and we're determined to find a path forward. And Kickstarter was one part of that puzzle.
Just to add to what Phil was saying is that when we decided, hey, we're going to go this Kickstarter route, and we don't want people to just blindly trust us or say, hey, we are the guys behind Diablo 2, just give us some money. That's why we really made it a strategy of putting out the demo at the same time, just so that people could see, okay, it's not completely made up. There's problems with the demo, but they'll see that, hey, there's good bones here. There's a lot of fun to be had, and this is the real deal. No one's doing a scheme to make out. So that was kind of a joint effort we'll start the Kickstarter and we'll give everybody a demo to play.
So a concern that I have with Kickstarter is that historically, games that use Kickstarter often don't necessarily deliver to the players, or of potentially lower quality than games that didn't need to use Kickstarter at all if they had enough funding. And it's only a result of circumstance that you're using Kickstarter. I'm sure your primary method here would have been to just, do it with private funding. And are you worried a little bit of being lumped in with other Kickstarter games as a result of this?
There's different levels of caliber even on Kickstarter, right? There's the true indie games that are trying to raise a couple of $100,000, and that's the whole budget for the game. And then there's been a number of higher profile games that, were funded through other sources and also did a Kickstarter. And I think when those don't succeed, that's a much darker spot, I think, on the whole proposition. And I think those are the ones that players remember. Somebody came in and said, we're not going to talk about names at all, but there's been some high profile not very good outcomes, and I think players are bitter about that. It's tough for players too. It's tough for everybody. The economy and the funding source and everything. So yeah, it's definitely that went into our consideration. We didn't want to ask players to take a risk. We don't want to ask them for hard-earned money because, we don't want to be lumped in with that, and like Erich was saying, we hope that having the demo available alleviates some of that risk. Like, you can play the game, you can see where we're at, you can imagine in your heads, and we can talk about where we need to go from here. And the Kickstarter isn't going to fund all of that. It'll help us move forward, and it'll make a big difference, and we'll be very, very grateful for it. And it could easily make the difference right now at this point in our journey.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're trying to be humble and grateful, and but we understand that it's that there's a I don't know how to put it. We all know how Kickstarter's been, so it's not like it's not all been a bed of roses.
I think the point you made earlier as well, where you're planning to go to GDC next month and secure a publishing deal, and it's worth stating to anyone who's worried about the Kickstarter and hasn't backed it yet, that a better result from the Kickstarter makes it much easier for these guys to go to publishers and say, look, there's demand for this game, can you please just give us some bridging money? Because it's easy money for the publisher there. They put some money in, the game gets finished, which it will be, because these guys have the pedigree and the demo to show where they're up to and a plan to finish it. Like, there's very low risk. With the money available, it's getting done and it's going to be good. And so the publisher will see, with demand for the game, this is easy money. They put the money in, they get the money out later when it does well, and life is good. So an advantage of backing it not only is, of course, you get to take part in the journey, but it also means that you make it exponentially easier for the game to get additional funding that it needs. And that's why I feel that if you're on the fence about it, and as Phil said, you can afford to, it's a nice thing, not only because, like, obviously the individual $25 or $40 you put in just pays for a small amount of development time, but every bit helps to cause a publisher to then throw millions more dollars in to get the game way bigger than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, it's a massive lever. It's, you think about, it might be, if a famous creator endorses this game, a publisher will take notice and say, like, oh, we need to fund these guys. That's rarely the case, because everybody, publishers, influencers can be paid for, they'll say one thing one day and another day it's just one person, they have their own community. The biggest thing by far that will influence a publisher or an investor's opinion is, have players said they want to buy this game? Are they wish listing it? Are they reviewing it? Are they funding a Kickstarter? Like, that kind of thing proves that there's an audience there. And that's the biggest single thing that will give, that will unlock a bigger amount of funding, that will let us turn this thing into what we all want it to be, what we want it to be, and what players are telling us they want it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
The point that was made earlier as well about the modding, where even if someone is on the fence about this and may not necessarily, fund the game, is that votes of confidence for the game that get it made also mean that modding ecosystem will exist, where the next generation of action RPG design that none of us are going to come up with comes out of that modding ecosystem, and means that 5 years from now we're all playing much better, different, innovative action RPGs as a result of the fact that there exists this scaffold for people to make it. Because as cool as Diablo 4 is, you're not going to be able to make the next action RPG by playing Diablo 4, but you potentially could by fiddling around with Darkhaven and discovering the secret source that other people haven't, Dota, Counter-Strike, and so on.
That's the vision.
Yeah. Somebody told me once, I don't know if they believe this, but they were saying, like, every mobile game in existence started off as a Warcraft 3 mod. And, I think it is an exaggeration, but, like, there's so much potential when you add in deeper systems, that you can't do in even Roblox, or you can't do in Fortnite, or you can't do in any of these other moddable games. So that's our hope. That's what we're working towards, is if you have a vision for an RPG that you want to make, you'll be able to build it in Darkhaven.
And you mentioned wishlisting as well, which is literally a free thing people can do. Like, even if you can't afford to fund the Kickstarter, like, I've wishlisted this game on Steam, and I would encourage viewers to do the same thing, because it's a vote for this direction of action RPG development. Even if the game itself isn't, something you want to buy right now, it's still a really nice gesture, because if they can go to a publisher and say, look, we need some more money to top up the amount we made from the Kickstarter, but we have 1 million wish lists, the publisher says, okay, I'm getting my checkbook out. And that's, that makes it a lot easier.
Yes, please wish list that.
Yeah. the easy free stuff that people can do is wishlist the game, play the demo, review it if you like it. You know, don't say anything you don't believe in, but join our Discord, sign up for our mailing list. Those are all things that just prove to publishers that people are interested in what we're doing.
What about feedback? Like, if people have played the demo and they want to give you feedback, what's the best way of them addressing that to you in a way that can be actioned most easily?
On our Discord is the most direct way that we'll see it, and we'll be able to see it forever. You know, like, reviews are good, but like, if you want to talk to us directly and talk to the community that's also playing it, like, our Discord's the best place to do that. Wouldn't you say, Peter and Eric?
Yeah, a lot of us are pretty active on the Discord these days.
And the feedback we've gotten from the demo has been, I mean, some of, you know, the critical things are hard to read sometimes, you know, like, I hate this thing. It's like, wow, really? But by far, most of the people are like, this is really good. It's really fun. There's things here that I'm excited to see what they do with it, you know, but it has given us a lot to think about, and it's made our next steps a lot more straightforward, I think, because we know now from a lot of players, you know, what they are looking for and what's really connecting and what, you know, maybe needs more work.
Well, it's been great having you guys on the channel today. I really enjoyed the deep dive into the technical stuff and some of the game design things we talked about. I found out a lot of new info about Diablo II, which will be very, very pleasing to me and a few of the viewers as well. And it was actually really cool how candid you guys were about the funding stuff, because it's difficult at the moment, and I appreciate the transparency there. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been good to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Had a good time talking and hashing through this stuff. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Really appreciate it. And thanks to your viewers too, for, you know, hopefully they're getting something interesting out of it. Cause we love this genre, and, you know, you've done arguably, I don't know, but, you know, we were there at the beginning, you know, and then you took it to the next step. And, you know, it's just been really cool to see, you know, where you've taken it and where, you know, the next generation is going to take it.
Thank you. Well, to the viewers, I hope you enjoyed the interview, and make sure to wishlist Darkhaven on Steam. Please check out the Kickstarter and back it if you can afford to. And thank you very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you next time.